the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all colleagues in the House of Commons this evening for their contribution to this important discussion that we're having around youth suicide in Indigenous communities. I think the discussion tonight actually marks a full understanding of the action that is needed towards strengthening, supporting, and ensuring survival and success of our Indigenous youth, of our Indigenous communities and families. The member for Timmins James Bay came to the House of Commons today asking for the help of Canada and Parliament to respond to the unfortunate acts of suicide in his riding in the community of Attawapiskat. He also knows that there are many other communities that share these sad circumstances and events across our country's Indigenous community. In my own riding, I have full communities today that are filled with grief on a weekly, on a monthly basis, as they are forced to say goodbye to another hopeful young person. Another person, Mr. Speaker, who decided to take their own life. Even for those young people who have lived a full life in Indigenous communities, some who have become strong leaders. And I remember a young girl that I met in one of the communities in my riding, and her name was Daru. Everybody knew her as Daru. Fantastic young woman in high school, leading the great example of young Inuk women and young Inuks in the community. She was a strong leader. She led the celebration of life in the loss of many of her peers. She led the youth healing circles. She led the youth onto the land. She worked with the elders. And a few short weeks ago, she took her own life because the grief and trauma of despair that surrounded her in trying to raise up the young people in her community was too much. It was too much. So even our healthiest young Indigenous people who are out there trying to make the difference don't often see the path forward. And sometimes we have to stop and reflect on the impact it's having on all people who try to lead in circumstances like this. Tonight, as we discuss this important issue in Parliament, it's getting close to midnight. I want us to remember that there are children in communities who are not able to close their eyes this evening because of fear and trauma, because of pain, because of the feeling of hopelessness that they experience. There are many young Indigenous people today who are unable to close their eyes because of the addictions that they suffer from. There are many of them that are still walking the streets in our villages, probably not aware of what they're even looking for. But the feeling of restlessness, of hopelessness, is the one reason that they cannot fix. There are children this evening without a safe house, a comfortable bed, or even looking forward to a better day to wake up to tomorrow. That's why we're here having this discussion. Suicide in Indigenous youth in our community is in a state of turmoil. it may be one community that brings a motion to Parliament, but it's shared by so many more, so many more, so many that we never hear about in the news. So many young people that take their lives in Indigenous communities every day that never makes a public announcement. What does that say about us as a society when we become accepting to a certain degree? I'm proud to stand here tonight amongst people that are not prepared to accept this. And I pray that there will be a way forward, and I know there is a way forward. And I think that what we've just recently seen in our country, the real change that we have seen, the real change in attitude towards Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, the real change of reaching out and lifting them up because we know they have been left behind. That is going to be the path forward. Just in recognizing that there is a responsibility by the people of our country to lift up Indigenous and the first people who came. That in itself will be change. Today, as I sat in the Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, I listened to the President of the National Women's Association of Canada. She spoke very eloquently, very passionately and emotionally about the work she's been doing in this country to help women and families and children. She talked about the progress they had made, but then slipped back. She talked about funding cuts for critical programs that were making a difference in communities that now are lost. Why does this happen? Why is it that when we find models that work and people that are willing to give every ounce of energy they have to make the change, that we walk away? I don't want to ever see those things happening in this country again, because every time you turn your back on being able to help one person, that's still one person that's falling through the cracks. With every one, there's another. When I listened to the president of NWAC today, I was reminded of the good people that we have in this country that are giving their time and energy, their commitment, their heart, and their patience to make this change. And that's why it's up to us to work with them. We just had a budget that came down in the country in which we will invest historically $8.4 billion over the next 5 years to increase and improve the social economic conditions of Indigenous people and their communities. It deals with clean water, it deals with early education, it deals with supportive housing and addressing poverty, shelters, it deals with counseling, supportive services, healthcare. All of these things are included. And you know why they're included? Because it's a recognition that we have to start with the basics. The basic foundation has to change. We have to be there to support Indigenous communities and Indigenous people. We also have to recognize that they're not all the same. There isn't a one size that fits all. For the first time in this country, we had a budget that recognized the needs of Inuit are different from First Nations and Métis. And we were able to invest in those directions. I heard people here this evening say it's not about investing money. Well, when children in First Nations schools are getting far less in education, then it's about money. When children in First Nations communities don't have proper health services and counseling, then it's about investment and money. So don't confuse the fact that there is an investment required. We recognize that, and even in the first budget have made moves to do that, and we're going to continue to do that. Mr. Speaker, a number of people this evening, when they talked about the fact it's 2016. Well, it is 2016. And I'm proud that we have a Prime Minister in this country and a government in this country that is recognizing the real need for reconciliation and that it requires investment in First Nations. And I'm happy that my colleague opposite is bringing these issues to the House of Commons. That's where they need to be. This is the House of people. This is where ideas and solutions should get generated. This is where we should be responding to people. And I'm proud to stand this evening and say, I will do my part. I will do my part to ensure that we help lift up the Indigenous communities in this country and lift up our young Aboriginal people that are bright and brilliant who need us right now. And I look forward to working with the Minister, with our government, and all my colleagues to make that happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.